Do I stay with Lightroom or switch to DxO? Sounds like a song title. Ever since Adobe moved to a subscription-only model with Creative Cloud back in 2013, phasing out perpetual licenses like CS6 and eventually ending standalone Lightroom updates in 2017, I have quietly kept an eye on alternative editing software. Not because I dislike Lightroom, far from it. In fact, I know it inside and out. I know exactly what I can get from it and how to get there quickly. But that's also the problem. When a piece of software becomes second nature, it disappears into the background. You stop thinking about buttons and sliders and start thinking about the image. And switching away from that kind of familiarity can be surprisingly difficult. So when DxO reached out and asked if I'd like to try PhotoLab 9, their alternative to Lightroom, I was excited but slightly apprehensive about the possibility of moving away from Adobe, and in particular, Lightroom Classic. Now, disclaimer time, DxO did send me PhotoLab 9 along with some of their plugins, free of charge, to try out and create content around my experience. It is important to say there's no obligation for me to be positive. Everything in this video is my honest opinion, with no input, approval from DxO. If, by the end, you're curious to try it yourself, you can download a free trial of PhotoLab 9, along with plugins like Film Pack, and if you do decide to purchase, I can offer you a 50% discount with code JamesM15. Now, one thing that's really interesting about DxO is where they actually come from. Before they were known for editing software, they spent years, decades really, scientifically analyzing camera sensors and lenses. They built their reputation on lab testing, measuring sharpness, distortion, vignetting, dynamic range, all the technical stuff most of us never see, but absolutely rely on. And all of that data didn't just disappear, it became the foundation of their software, and the advantages of that are something we'll get into a little later on. So PhotoLab 9, as I mentioned earlier, is essentially the Lightroom Classic alternative. And I use Lightroom Classic a lot. It does exactly what I needed to do. So switching to PhotoLab 9 brought up some real questions for me, and that's how I'm going to approach this review. By the end of this video, one thing will decide whether I stay with Lightroom or switch to DxO, and honestly, it wasn't what I expected. First real question was about the user interface. When I first loaded the program, I generally wondered, am I about to be met with confusion and despair? Is this going to feel clunky and slow? But honestly, no. In terms of the main editing window, it's actually very intuitive and surprisingly similar to Lightroom Classic. You can even remap keyboard shortcuts to match Lightroom, which really helps ease the transition. The panels make sense, the symbols are clear, and most things are exactly where you would instinctively expect them to be. There are a few differences in tools, particularly the naming. For example, what Lightroom calls Dehaze, DxO calls Clearview Plus. Lightroom's Dehaze slider works both ways. You can remove haze, but you can also push it into the negative values to add atmosphere back into an image, which is something I often like to do in my edit. Clearview Plus, on the other hand, is primarily designed as a corrective tool, but it doesn't really function as a creative haze tool in the same way as it does in Lightroom Classic. You can create that softer atmospheric look in DxO using local adjustments, tone curves and contrast controls, but it's more of an in-depth process rather than a single quick slider. Let's move on to my next question, which is importing, lack of catalogs, and how it actually feels organizing projects in DxO. This is a big consideration for photographers who shoot events, sports weddings, and other high volume work. The sheer number of images and the uniform edit or look you create for that project means having a catalog you can return to instantly is incredibly valuable. In Lightroom, everything goes into this master library. You import, it builds, previews, it indexes everything, and that becomes your world. DxO doesn't work like that. It doesn't have one big master catalog you can feed images into. Instead, it looks directly at your folders on your hard drive. Whatever structure you already have, that's what it uses. Now here's where indexing comes in. The first time you open a folder in DxO, it indexes it. It reads the files, builds previews, and stores edit information in its own database, and optionally sidecar files. So it's building information in the background, just not in that big import everything into one system way that Lightroom kind of does. It's more folder by folder indexing rather than one global import process. You're not committing your entire archive into a system. You're just opening a folder and working. Projects are basically curated groups of images. They don't contain the raw files and they don't move anything. They simply reference files that already exist in your folders. So if I've got a 2026 Cardiff night shoot and a 2025 random archive, I can pull images from both into a project called Review Examples without reorganizing anything on my drive. The files stay where they are. The edits stay attached to the files. The project is simply a way of grouping them together for a purpose. And I think this is where the real question is for me. Am I someone who constantly searches across 10 years of work using keywords and metadata? Or am I someone who shoots, edits, exports, and moves on? Because if you rely heavily on deep catalog searches, Lightroom still wins. But if your workflow is more contained, folder-based, project-based, DxO's system might not feel limiting at all. It just feels a little different. Now let's talk about workflow and plugins. I regularly use plugins like Topaz and Dehancer, and inside Lightroom, the process is incredibly smooth. I simply right-click on the image I want to work on, choose Edit in Dehancer, for example. It opens up that file, it makes my adjustments, I close it, and the edited version drops straight back into my Lightroom catalog automatically. It's seamless, no extra steps, no messing about. Now with DxO, things are a little different. DxO has its own plugins like Film Pack, which integrate exactly how you'd expect, as they are part of that ecosystem. But what about third-party plugins like Dehancer? Well, it does work. You can export images from DxO into Dehancer. It's quite straightforward to do so. You can make your edits and save it, but here's the difference. It doesn't automatically loop back into DxO in the same way it does with Lightroom. Instead, you have to manually navigate back to a Dehancer saved file, usually next to the original image, and then re-import into DxO. Compared to Lightroom's round-trip workflow, it feels clunkier, especially if you're working on multiple images. And when you're editing at speed, those extra little steps do add up. Now, having said that, when I use Dehancer with DxO, I actually treat Dehancer as the final creative grade. So by the time the image goes into Dehancer, I've already done the technical work, exposure corrections and lens optimization. What I'm doing in Dehancer is the look, the character, the mood. So realistically, I'm not planning to bring that back into DxO afterwards. Once I'm done in Dehancer, that's the finished image. So yes, the lack of seamless round tripping is worth mentioning, but for the way I personally work, it doesn't really change much. It's more of a workflow difference than a workflow problem. So features, that was the next question. And in terms of core tools, everything you'd expect is here. Exposure, highlights, shadows, blacks, white balance. The fundamentals are all present. Masking, though, is a big one for my editing style. Lightroom's masking is extremely efficient. You've got subject, sky, background, and selections, plus linear and radial gradients. DxO takes a slightly different approach. It leans more heavily into the AI-driven masking, and it's impressively accurate. You've got AI selections alongside control lines and radial gradients, so you're not losing flexibility. The AI brush tool in PhotoLab 9 is genuinely excellent. It does a very good job of understanding what you're trying to select, and that can save you a lot of time. That said, I do think Lightroom handles masks subtraction in a slightly more intuitive way. DxO has inversion and refinement tools, but I sometimes find them a little less fluid. That may simply be familiarity. It could just be a learning curve, but overall the masking tools in DxO are powerful, just not quite as intuitive as they are for me in Lightroom Classic. Noise reduction. Now, this is where things get interesting, especially for low light work. DxO's DeepPRIME noise reduction is genuinely impressive. It works at the raw level, analyzing the sensor data before the image is even fully rendered. And in high ISO files, particularly night photography with a Micro Four Thirds sensor, it can recover detail while keeping the image looking natural. It doesn't feel overly plastic or over smooth. It retains texture and detail while keeping the image looking clean. Lightroom's AI denoise is also very good. It's fast, effective, and integrates seamlessly into the workflow. But side by side, DeepPRIME often feels slightly more refined in the way it handles detail and color noise. If you shoot a lot in low light, events, weddings, street photography at night, this is a genuine strength for DxO. Another area where DxO really stands out is lens correction. Because of their lab testing background, DxO builds dedicated optical modules for specific camera and lens combinations. When you open a RAW file, it automatically applies distortion correction, vignetting correction, and sharpness optimization, all tailored to that exact lens. Lightroom also handles lens profiles well, but DxO feels slightly more scientific in the way it approaches optical corrections. It's less of a generic profile, more of a calibrated match. For someone like me, especially shooting at night, wide open, sometimes with vintage lenses or focal reducers, that level of optical refinement does make a difference. Subtle, but it's there. And again, it reinforces that DxO is incredibly strong on the technical image quality side. So after using PhotoLab for a while, that's really where I landed. The interface is familiar, the workflow is different but manageable. And when it comes to the technical side, noise reduction, lens correction, and sharpening, DxO is genuinely impressive. Which brings me back to the question I started this video with. Do I stay with Lightroom or switch to DxO? And honestly, it came down to one tool, which is generative fill. This is a fantastic tool. It allows you to clean up a frame in ways that are subtle but incredibly powerful. For me, it's not about dramatically changing a photo with AI. Used carefully and sparingly, generative fill can save time and sometimes even save an image. When I'm shooting street photography, I'm not in control of every element in the frame. You can move, zoom, recompose, but sometimes you still end up with small distractions that take away from the image. Sometimes a scene just needs a little tidy up to make the subject clearer or the story stronger. Generative fill is a huge advantage for Lightroom here. DxO still relies on the traditional cloning tool, and once you've used generative fill, it's hard to go back. Now that doesn't mean I'm completely opposed to moving away from Lightroom. I do think the subscription model is becoming ridiculous, and there are other tools and workflows I'm interested in exploring. If I find a solution that replaces that part of the workflow, then honestly, I wouldn't hesitate. Because when it comes to the core job of developing raw image, DxO is exceptional. And if that final piece of the puzzle falls into place, DxO could very easily become my one and only editing program. So what is the plan for me? I'm not gonna not use DxO because I think it's very useful for me for when I shoot rugby games on the weekend. I'm more than happy to process quickly those images through DxO, add in all the corrections which I need, and I find that works very well in DxO, particularly if I'm shooting at high ISOs because I need a fast shutter. DxO really comes in handy there. But when I'm doing more creative edits, I think I still will stick to Lightroom just because of the negative value adjustments with dehazing and masking, and also the generative fill tool, which is just far superior than it is to, say, the likes of the cloning tool. I am, however, going to downgrade my subscription from Adobe to just the photography package as I have DaVinci. I don't need all the bells and whistles like with Adobe Premiere and what have you. So more than happy to downgrade and keep DxO. And I think I'll be quite happy until I find a replacement for Lightroom permanently. So yeah, that's it for me, guys. Hope you enjoyed this video. I did have to script this video, I've got to be honest, because it was a lot of information to go through. But I hope it was useful for you. Thanks for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. And I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.